Welcome to the first installment of our virtual faith study. And if you're watching this and you don't know the context, let me just briefly share with you how we came to this moment. We are living through the pandemic and there is no faith study in person here at Bethany. So we offered for several weeks some looks at our stained glass windows, which obviously include Bible stories. And I explored some of those stories with you with the beautiful music of Shawn Whynot in the background. We are transitioning now into some questions, some faith questions that come from members of Bethany. And so today I'm going to focus on a question that was given to me by two, not one, but two people from Bethany. And in subsequent weeks, I will look at some other questions from persons in Bethany. And then we'll transition into a hymn that Anne and Shawn will share with you that again comes from someone at Bethany, and it ties into our reflection. So today, the question, and it's a multi-formed question, has to do with the nature of who God is in our difficult and challenging time. So the question is, what might God be trying to say to us in this time of pandemic and multi-pandemics? Because in all probability, we've lived through previous pandemics and we will certainly be living through future ones. Then another member of the congregation also asked the question, why would God or how would God be sending this pandemic to us? That's a more intentional question. And then the third part of the question was, could God be trying to tell us that we're moving too quickly and that we need to slow down? So those are all parts of a larger question, which has to do with the nature of who God is. Now, let me begin by saying that most of us went through the Sunday school system, went through the Sunday school time. Not everyone, but many of us. And as part of Sunday school, we learned many stories in the Bible, but two stories in the Bible I suspect were very big parts of our Sunday school formation. One was, of course, the Great Flood, where Noah built an ark, right? And the other one would be Moses leading God's people away from Pharaoh and Egypt, through the Red Sea and into the Promised Land. Both of those stories depict God very active in the world, moving into human history, creating events where people are liberated, if you will. That's the case, of course, with Moses. Or in the case of Noah, God looking at the world and saying, this is a mess, I'm going to start over again, and I'm going to use Moses and Moses' family to essentially do over. Yeah? And many people who are more literally minded look at those stories in that sense and see them as history in the way that, when we read about our own history, the fathers of Confederation meeting in Charlottetown and who was there and what they did, right? Or, in any history, an account of history, we have a sense of real individuals doing things, and we can go to a museum and we can see all the tangible things. The Bible was written, in many cases, the stories that were written down were often written down well after the fact. They were not written in real time. And furthermore, the Hebrew people, the Jews, the nation of Israel, whatever term you want to use, did not think in literal terms about how God had worked in their history. Now, they did believe and do believe that God has worked through human history to achieve certain things that God wished to happen. That is true. But the specifics around the numbers of people involved, the names of kings and kingdoms and all of that, often in our Older Testament, are not always consistent with different books, right? And so that is often the cause of disbelief. There are people who will say, well, I don't believe in God because in this battle, X number of people are mentioned or this king is mentioned. In reality, Jewish people, the nation of Israel, understood that God works in history but the specifics of these stories are not as important as the overall intention. So when we look at, first of all, Noah's flood, we see the intention being that things have really become unruly, that human history has evolved to a place where things are not going well. And there is a need to start over. There is a need for God's people to reestablish their covenant, to start over again, to leave the past behind in a kind of very sharp break and begin again. And a great way to illustrate that story is to talk about a story like Noah and building an ark and starting over again and in a new land, in a new way, and a new covenant. It's a great story, and it really illustrates, for me personally, times in my life when I have felt adrift, when I felt that things in my life were not going the way that they ought to go, when I was not living in accordance with the plan that God had set out for me, and I needed a sharp break. Yeah. Now, do I understand that story in literal terms? No, I don't. That doesn't mean that if they find an ark, and people have speculated that certain things are the ark and not the ark. I don't know. But the story itself to me it's not necessary that it be literally true. What is necessary is that that's how I believe God does work. There are times where God looks at the world and says there's something definitely wrong and there is a need for a change. Now, do I believe that in that particular story, all of those people of human history on the planet were essentially washed away in a flood, killed because of God's wrath? No, I don't believe that. I don't think that's necessarily how God works. And I think this brings me to the question that is asked about this pandemic and how God is working. It's one thing for all of us to speculate where God might be in this pandemic and say, like, as people who are well, as people who live in a very prosperous part of the world, we look at this and say, well, maybe this is God telling us something. Well, maybe it is. But do understand that all of these stories, when we ask ourselves, where is God? We need to step apart from ourselves. Because, my friends, if you think about the story of Noah and the ark, or if you think of the story of Moses and the Egyptian people, there are a whole lot of people in both of those stories who end up dead and end up dying very gruesome deaths. And if you only think about the victors of those stories, if you only think about the people who survive, and we on this side of life would think that way, well then, unfortunately, our minds go only to, if you will, an outcome of the story, where we say to ourselves, that's what God meant. God is telling us to slow down. God is telling it. My friends, I think that if you look at the story in terms of all of the people involved, from the people who would lose their life in a flood to the people who would lose their lives as the Pharaoh's army was drowned in the Red Sea, we can say to ourselves, those parts of the story are not as important in the overall arc of God being on the side of justice. Martin Luther King once said that history records that the cause of justice the cause of history bends toward justice. And I believe that if we look at this pandemic and we look at how we are coalescing together and leaning on the justice of God and leaning on the truth of God and leaning on the presence of God, we will know that we are not alone. And that what God is doing in this pandemic is not so much causing illness for people to die or saving some people and not others, because that would be a convenient way to read the story. Rather, it is that God is showing us that in the frailty and the mortality of our bodies, there is a deeper empathy and love and connection that bonds us to all of us, and that we are called in this time to not just think of ourselves, but to think of our sisters and brothers in the spirit of community and compassion. That is my offering. It is my perspective. I don't claim it is in any way a certainty, but it is what I believe, and it is my faith. And I do thank those who have asked this question. And now we will transition to my colleagues Anne and Shawn. They're going to sing Precious Lord, Take My Hand, which again speaks of God holding our hand through the darkness. Thank you for being with us.